Hello, my name is Ashlyn Hopper. I'm going to be talking about the history of sign language as well as looking a little bit into the use of quote baby signs. So ASL has a relatively short history. There was no standardized sign language in America until about 1817. Until then, home signs were mostly used. Home signs are just some form of nonverbal communication that the child and the adult will come up with to represent verbs or objects. Unfortunately, this is very isolating for the deaf children because communication is relatively limited for one, and for two, they have no form of outside communication either. Three villages ended up being the exception to the rule: Martha's Vineyard, Henniker, and Sandy River Valley. They just had an abundance of deaf people in these three villages for some reason, and they figured out how to communicate with each other. These kinds of signs would go on to be known as village signs. Thomas Hopkins Gallaudet would go on to start the first American school for the deaf in 1817. The reason being is because he discovered that deaf children were not as dumb as previously thought. And so he actually traveled to France to figure out how the Institute for the Deaf there taught their deaf children any kind of language. So he would go on to learn French Sign Language called LSF, and he somehow convinced the principal's assistant to come to America with him to become the first teacher at his school. So because you had this congregation of the home and village signs in one place, that these children just accidentally transformed LSF to closer to what we know ASL today. As far as language connections go, LSF is still considered the sister language to ASL, and LSF is the reason why ASL is an SOV language rather than the English SVO. At one point or another, it used to be called Amazon. It's long since been obsolete, and is simply called ASL. Linguistics has a very volatile history with ASL. For the longest time, linguists believed that anything that wasn't a spoken language didn't fit the definition of a true language, and was somehow inferior to that of a spoken language. William Stokoe, or Stokowee, I'm not sure how to pronounce his last name, was an American linguist who documented ASL being used at Gallaudet University in Florida. And he became convinced and insisted that ASL fit the definition of a language. He was so insistent that he actually became very involved in activism for the deaf community. He also argued that deaf schools should teach manualism over oralism. Oralism is teaching an oral language as the primary form of communication. Essentially, they were teaching these deaf children to pretend to not be deaf. Manualism is teaching a sign language as a primary form of communication. That doesn't mean that these schools back in the day didn't teach ASL. They did, but the teachers were very insistent that the children should be speaking as a primary form of communication with anyone who was hearing. He also, for whatever reason, went on to create a transcript for ASL, which you can see at the bottom left-hand corner of your screen. The relationship between them is like a hand shape, and the way that the hand shape moves. I don't know how to read it. I've never seen it in my life. It is called the Stokowee notation if you want to go learn more for yourselves. So with the rise of social media and the rise of influencers, specifically like those who are mothers, somehow we created this form of, quote, baby signs. People who encourage teaching children baby signs claim that there are major benefits to the children's brain development, specifically the linguistic development. However, scientists are still very split on this topic. There simply just isn't enough data to prove that this is true. Opinions of the use of these baby signs in the deaf community are mixed. On the one hand, the more people who are exposed to ASL, the better, because maybe they'll become curious enough to learn ASL from themselves. However, many also know that these mothers will simply stop teaching when the child learns to speak. Baby signs are a coined term by hearing influencers with hearing babies. Baby signs are ASL. It is just so simplistic in the movements that even a baby can do it. And many in the deaf community would like us to stop calling them baby signs. So I became kind of curious to find out the feelings of the deaf community with these baby signs a little bit more. Did they consider it appropriation? Everybody in the deaf community pretty much agrees that teaching somebody a language is not appropriation, and it would be silly to consider it as such. However, they do find it extremely disrespectful when a hearing influencer decides to post videos in ASL and then monetize them when they themselves don't fully know the language and have not immersed themselves within the community. They also find it very disrespectful when a hearing person will monetize a video teaching ASL, again, when they themselves don't even know ASL and are not integrated within the deaf community. The exception to the rule is the CODAs. CODAs are child or children of deaf adults. It is when a hearing child that is born to one or more deaf parent. They are considered part of the deaf community because ASL is their L1 language. So they don't find it disrespectful if they themselves go on to monetize videos of the same thing just because A, they know the language, and B, they honestly would rather have the CODAs themselves exposing more hearing people to ASL. The big irony with the use of baby signs is that hearing parents will teach their hearing children ASL, but they will not teach their deaf children ASL. And this is extremely frustrating. As many as 8% or more of deaf children will be language deprived by the time they enter primary school at around 4 or 5 years old. And this unfortunately occurs because in the past, and still to this day, there has been a misdirection of science. They believe that the oral language learning will be hindered somehow, which is just absolutely not true. There have also been excuses from parents as to why they themselves cannot learn ASL so that they can teach their children ASL. And there are more excuses. I'm sure that there are more reasons than that, but these are the top two. But I'm curious to know what everyone's thoughts are on the use of baby signs. And is it fair to not fully teach a child a language of any kind, not just ASL? Is it fair to just stop teaching a child a language when they start speaking a different language? That works side page.